Welcome to the Cold-Case Christianity Broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining me at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. This week, I want to talk about something that I often talk about in my presentations, and I usually offer it toward the end of a presentation. And I do it because a number of years ago, on our Facebook platform, and by the way, if you haven't followed us on Facebook, please join us there. On Facebook and Twitter, I post the top 12 to 15 articles every day from over 700 bloggers who are friends of mine in the world of Christian apologetics. And so what we have there is a collection of like the top 10 to 15 best stories of that day that'll help you become a better Christian case maker. And on that page, I took the time to ask a question a number of years ago. Just surveyed, well, why did you become a Christian, or why are you a Christian? It was when I first started the page, so I don't think many people even knew who I was or knew my story, but I had enough response that I was able to write an article about it because all the responses broke down into several categories. And so I made a list of those categories. So today's episode, I'm simply going to talk about what I think is the best reason to be a Christian. When I ask people, why are you a Christian, and I put them in categories, and I did this later for a book called Forensic Faith, I'll tell you that it was eye-opening. And I wanted to kind of offer a response. Now, at that time, I wrote 2 articles about this. They've been reposted a couple of times, but when I first posted, this is probably like now maybe 12 years ago, on our old website, which was pleaseconvinceme.com. So this is back a number of years ago when I was a youth pastor, before I even came out of law enforcement, and I still have a couple of cases that are dangling, but I mean, I had maybe, at the time, maybe like 8 cases that I was working. So it was a very busy time of my life. And I wrote 2 articles which are now posted on our Cold Case Christianity website. So let me show them to you. You can just search for these. They're on our website. One is called I'm Not a Christian Because It Works For Me. And the other is called I'm Not a Christian For Any of These Good Reasons. Now, that's where I want to start today's show, is to say this. Look, I think these are good reasons, the responses I got. That they're not like they're illegitimate responses. Of course, these are good reasons to be a Christian. But it wasn't my story. And because I wasn't raised in the church, I wondered if this was common. As a matter of fact, later on when I wrote the book Forensic Faith, I narrowed these down from the kind of 6 categories I'm about to give to you. I narrowed it down to 3 categories. Because I did a much more robust kind of survey across the nation in local congregations where I was speaking to ask the question, why are you guys Christians? And I think this is something that would help us. I actually think we would have a greater impact, let's say, in the world around us, and especially with young people, if we did adopt what I think is the best reason to be a Christian. Now I want to share with you in 3 segments, 2 each segment, some of the responses I got on that initial survey of why are you a Christian. And like I said before, these are not bad reasons. This is why the article I wrote is I am not a Christian. None of these responses were why I was a Christian. And what was interesting is, and even now when I ask this question, unless you're familiar with my work and know where I'm headed with this question, when I ask, why are you a Christian? I think the best reason to be a Christian is never typically offered by anyone. And I still think it's the best reason to be a Christian. But interestingly, when I ask, why are you a Christian? No one ever offers it. Really? Instead, we get one version or another of these 6 responses. Let's take a look at them. Here's the first one. And I did not become a Christian for this reason. I did not become a Christian because I was raised in the church. So that is the number 1 response you are going to get if you ask this question of your friends and family members. If you even think about it yourself, it's that you were raised this way. Your parent. This is not uncommon. The chief determiner of what you will believe is, what did your parents believe? Because even though some of us step away from our parents' beliefs, most of us don't. And this is true of a secular worldview or any other religious system. Why is Islam growing at the pace that it's growing? Because they have a lot more kids than we do. And kids typically, generally, adopt the view held by their parents. So you can grow a faith system based on biological growth rather than proselytizing if you simply have a bunch of kids, because most of your kids are probably going to believe what you believed. Now, I think that may be changing a little bit in an information world. But this is still the number one answer I get, even now, if I ask this question, and I talked about this in Forensic Faith, that people will say, I'm a Christian because I was raised in the church. This is not a bad reason to be a Christian, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. You could believe something because you were raised that way, and that thing you believe is completely false. So that's why I think it's important for us to take that additional step. But I do know that many of us are believers right now and would call ourselves Christians because we were raised this way. We were raised up in the church. Let me give you a second response that I get a lot from people, and this is where I got this response. And usually this would be some longer testimonial story that people will give me, but in the end it comes down to this truth. And I was not, this didn't happen for me, but so I put it this way. I also didn't become a Christian because my friends were Christians, although a lot of people will say that a friend brought them to church. A friend at school shared the gospel. Some friend joined a group, joined a Campus Crusade for Christ group. It was a social impact that their friends came around to them, and for some reason their friends and associates were the ones who either first proclaimed the message to them or embraced them over a period of time and convinced them it was true, or what, just they wanted to be in that social group sometimes. If you read through the testimony of these folks, it really comes down to that their friends were Christians. Now, I was raised in Southern California at a time in the 60s and 70s, well, I'll be honest with you, it was a pretty large area. And I did not know anybody who was a Christian. So no Christians in my friend group ever invited me to church. I didn't have friends who were Christians. That's not unusual in large metropolitan areas. So this was not my story, but I can see why this could be powerful. But, you know, I mean, friends get you into all kinds of situations. Most of us, as parents, would say, I don't want you to necessarily follow your friends, because not necessarily, your friends aren't necessarily telling you the truth, and your friends aren't necessarily leading you someplace good. So to say that I have embraced a metaphysical, large view of the world simply because my friends possessed it, that could be kind of dicey, don't you think? Anyway, for me, neither one of these was a reason why I became a Christian, although these are very popular answers amongst people who I surveyed. Let's take a break. I'll come back and give you two more reasons that people offer. Although they weren't my reasons to be a Christian, there are two more that were offered in the survey.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
What tactics should we expect the critics of Christianity to use against us?
Well, I mean, every time you do a case and the prosecutor presents their one side of the case, it's not as though defense attorneys sit there and go, wow, that was really good, I don't have anything to say. No, instead, even though they lose these cases that I've worked on, they'll take time to present a case. And they have a certain series of tactics they'll use, approaches they'll use in order to overcome the evidence we've presented. So for example, when you're working on circumstantial cases that have a large number of small pieces of evidence that point to the same conclusion and they have cumulative power, what I see defense attorneys doing is pointing to those individual pieces and trying to disqualify each one. I can explain those 20 pieces in 20 alternative explanations. Or they want to kind of undercut the value of each one. In other words, they want us to focus on the microcosm of each piece rather than see how the whole thing points together cumulatively to the same conclusion. I don't want you to see the forest through the trees. And that's what I see happening here as well. But you have to keep in mind though, if I've got one unifying explanation for these 20 pieces of evidence, or the alternative is I've got to have 20 other explanations for all the same pieces of evidence, which is the most reasonable conclusion? The 20 alternative explanations rather, or the one unifying, this guy happens to be guilty. So that's the kind of thing we do in trial. But we also see, though, at some point, it's not unusual to see a defense attorney try to undercut the reliability of the key investigator, for example, or a key witness. If I get to the place where I can make that person look bad on a personal level, maybe even have that person on the stand seem a little bit snarky or a little bit irritable. It's about character, and if I lack a substantive evidential rebuttal, I do sometimes see defense attorneys becoming quite snarky about just kind of an ad hominem attack, where they're just kind of attacking our nature. And I think I see the same kind of thing. Both those tactics I also see when skeptics will try to look at our case, undercut the individual pieces, try to come to the character, kind of make us look foolish in an effort to denigrate the quality of the evidence we're presenting. Those are at least two tactics that I see often used in trial that I also see on blogs, on the internet, anywhere where I see conversation. And one last thing, Bobby, we got to be careful as Christians that we don't take the same approach. I expect the defense attorney to do what it is he's been hired to do. And I expect opponents of Christianity to behave in a certain way. They're not Christians. What I don't want to see, though, is when we as Christians adopt the same tactics. Then I think we really have to kind of check ourselves.
Yeah, well said.
Okay, of all the ways that people will list that they became a Christian or why they became a Christian, when asked that question, why did you share with me your story of how you became a Christian? I got a large body of these that I thought were interesting. It was that people at some point had a longing for God. And that is, I think, an interesting observation that people made in their own lives. Looking back later on, they could say this, that I wanted to know God. That's not why I became a Christian. I didn't become a Christian because I wanted to know God. But this is not an unusual, this is offered occasionally by people, that they finally got to a point where they were at the end of themselves, let's say, and they were just ready to know God, or they had a curiosity about God. I managed to go 35 years and either not give him a thought on a daily basis, or when I did give him a thought, it was something sarcastic based on a behavior I saw on the part of Christians in my life, like a lot of the people I arrested who would say they were Christians, or the lame defense that some certain Christians could offer. If people got kind of preachy around me, I knew how to stop that preachiness by simply offering an objection that would shut them down. So I was pretty far from God. And I had no desire to know him, because it'd be like, to me, it'd be like the equivalent of saying, well, yeah, I want to know Santa Claus. I want to know the Tooth Fairy. Well, who does that? Who wants to know imaginary things? And that's where I saw God. God was this imaginary thing. Why in the world would I want to know an imaginary thing? Why would I want to twist my reasoning to the point where I decided it would be a good thing to know an imaginary thing? That sounded silly to me. But there are people who actually are seeking God. And now again, I would argue theologically it's because God is calling, right? But this was not where I was. And it certainly isn't, I was surprised that I was interested in God. But this is not my story. Is it a good reason to believe? Yeah, of course. I mean, who could not want to honor people who want to know God? This is something that you see honored in the pages of Scripture, both in the Old and New Testament. Even those who are not Jews, who were Gentiles who wanted to know God, are given honorary descriptions, right? They are honored in their descriptions. So I think it's a good reason to be a Christian. I just don't, it wasn't my reason. Let me go one more in this segment. And that's this. Some of the people have listed this. This is not why I became a Christian. I didn't become a Christian because I wanted to go to heaven, but a lot of people said they got to a place where maybe they were sick or whatever, and they started thinking about eternal things. And that was their desire to live eternally in heaven with God that first prompted them to become a Christian, or at least consider the claims of Christianity. Now look, I don't know. It was always, I can tell you as a skeptic, this was the thing that I thought motivated most believers. There's something in it for me. Life and I don't want to die. Have you ever seen The Invention of Lying? It's a movie that's really a sarcastic movie in a sense. It's the star of the movie is a pretty committed atheist. He's a very vocal atheist, and he's a comedian. And he's done this movie in which he kind of offers, imagine a world in which nobody lies. Everyone just tells the truth. But then this guy he learns how to lie, first person ever to learn it. He invents it and realizes its benefits. Right? Think about that for a second. It's kind of a funny premise. But where does he learn? He learns at the deathbed. I think it's his mom who's dying, who he wants to offer the false hope of eternity. So he strainingly invents this idea of saying something that's not true, which, in the story, no one's ever done before. But the point that the jab that's being taken at Christianity is simply that, yeah, this lie is based on a desire. We invented this hope, this false hope, because nobody wants to die. And so I always kind of thought that myself. I thought as an atheist, that's probably what motivates most people. And I was always skeptical of people who said they came to faith on their deathbed. Well, yeah, the gun's at your head, but I've learned as a Christian that I don't know how God works and what God is doing in the life of anyone in the years preceding our deathbed. And deathbed conversions, I think, are absolutely within the realm of reasonability as far as I'm concerned as a Christian. I don't doubt them like I used to. But I'm such a skeptic anyway as a cop that I always think, oh, what's in it for him? You know, what is he trying to get out of this? That this kind of thinking I would not have allowed myself to explore this kind of thing, even if there's some benefit. I would have been so stubborn, like Christopher Hitchens, that if someone tells you on my deathbed I had a last-minute conversion, they're a liar. Because I was so stubborn that I was not going to bend my knee then. It would seem like a cop-out to me. So I would have resisted. Even if it was true, I would never have admitted it because I'd been too stubborn to that point and too prideful and too opposed to the idea that I should get something out of this, and that's what's motivating me to believe it's true. But I think it's reasonable that people, of course, as we get older, we start thinking about the things that transcend this life. I should hope you would. And I think this is a reasonable approach, is when we get to that place where we're thinking about what happens when you die. I've got a friend I've shared with you before, James Borcardo, wrote a book called Unsilenced. And in that book, he simply says it's a great place to start your conversations. What do you think happens when you die? Where do you go after you die? That's a great question to ask people. It's not only one, it's diagnostic. It tells you where they stand, but it also tells you if they have any hope. And you can provide the hope they don't have. Anyway, this was not, though, why I became a Christian. So let's take a break. I'll give you 2 more responses to the survey, and then I'll finally give you what I think is the best reason for any of us to be a Christian. I have a good friend, and he'll tell a story about when he was in college. He was shaken by a professor who challenged him and didn't think Christianity was true. And do you know how he challenged him? It's pretty simple. He said, just do me a favor. Go read your 4 Gospels, just the Passion Week and all 4 Gospels, and you tell me if this is true. And so my friend, for the first time, really sat down and compared the Passion Week and all 4 Gospels, and he saw that they are not written exactly the same. And as a matter of fact, his professor made a big deal out of all the differences between each account. You can't trust, if the witnesses won't agree, then you can't trust it, right? Wrong. I was looking at the Gospels for the first time. And the one thing that didn't shake me was that they don't match. They're not the same. They're not word for word. As a matter of fact, sometimes they're 1 angel or 2 angels. They're different, right? They're all kind of different. Are they lying to you? Well, that never bothered me because by the time I started reading the Gospels, I was already investigating cases. And I was already talking to eyewitnesses. And I'm here to tell you a little secret. You ready? Witnesses never agree. Ever. I've never had a case in which 2, 3, 4 witnesses ever agree. They don't. And I know as I'm taking these statements from these witnesses that I'm thinking to myself, oh, the defense attorney is going to have just make a lot out of this big deal that they don't agree. But this is the nature of reliable eyewitness testimony. Do you realize when I get called out on a murder scene, I only have 1 request of the dispatcher. They'll call me in the middle of the night. Okay, you got to go to the corner of this, and there's going to be an officer there waiting. I'll always say, okay, so there's an officer there? Yes. Are there witnesses there? Yes. Separate the eyewitnesses. That's the only request I make on a call out. Separate the eyewitnesses. Do you know why I ask that question and I make that request? Because I don't want them to talk to each other. Because if they do and I get there, there'll be 1 story told 4 times. No. I don't want 1 story told 4 times. I want 4 kind of almost like apparently contradictory stories they'll be told from 4 different witnesses. My job as the detective is to puzzle that back together. And that's okay. That's the way reliable eyewitness testimony sounds. If I got there and they told me the same thing word for word, I'd know something was up. And if you had 4 Gospels that told you exactly the same thing about Jesus, you would know something. Do you think for a second that skeptics would be less inclined to argue about it if all the Gospels said word? No, they would say that's collusion. They would say you can't trust them. The fact that they don't line up, the fact that they don't agree entirely is what makes them reliable. It was the earmark that I said, okay, at least we're beginning someplace like I begin in all my cases. I've got to figure out how each one of these is actually telling me the truth. but from some other perspective, either geographic or personal, that'll explain why there are variations. And if you do that as well, you'll see that those accounts are exactly what eyewitness accounts look like. So I had even increased confidence because the accounts didn't agree, and you should too. Okay, as I've surveyed these responses in the last, say, 5 years, I've realized that the next one I'm about to give you is probably number 3. It's pretty high on the list. It's higher than I'm actually giving it to you here on the show today. But it's always some version of kind of like, hey, you know, I used to be a jerk, and then I met Jesus, and I'm no longer such a jerk anymore. That kind of a response. In other words, that I was transformed by the power of God, and that's why I'm a Christian. So here's how I put it. And this is not my experience. I did not become a Christian because I needed to change my life, because I hit rock bottom, because I was in a place of need. That is true for a lot of us. And I think it's a good reason. I think sometimes God will drive you to that point where the only way to look is up. You're at the bottom. He's driven you to the bottom. He's allowed you to drive yourself to the bottom, let's put it that way. And as you got to the bottom, you now realize the only place to look is up. And you need to change. And so now you desperately cry out for the last thing. Now you truly have come to the end of yourself and the end of your resources. And you need transformation. You need something to change. Look, that story has been repeated throughout history. That story is probably repeated in Scripture a number of times, in the Old Testament for sure. And so you see that people look at the prodigal son in the New Testament. You get to the end of yourself. You're now eating with pigs, and suddenly it doesn't look so bad to look up. That wasn't my story. But I actually think that's how God often works with us. Is that if you haven't been paying attention, God will suddenly get your attention. That just wasn't my personal story. I was not at the end of myself. I didn't feel a sense of needing transformation. Maybe my own arrogance and pride. I've been in the same relationship with my wife for 41 years. We had a great marriage, great family, great kids, great career before any of this happened to me. As a matter of fact, I think it's been harder since. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I actually think, so it wasn't that was driving me. But if that is your story, God bless it, because that's a great story. And I used to think, my testimony is so lame. I don't have a story where I'm on my knees, lost everything, and God did this amazing work in my life. And I will tell you, if you go to conferences, especially men's conferences, probably about 80% of the speakers or more are simply going to give you a testimony that's like that, where they're going to say, hey, I hit the bottom, and God did this amazing work in my life. And I think that's a absolutely valid, look, if you're looking for evidence, there should be more than just the evidence of textual criticism or history or all the approaches I take in cold case Christianity. There should also be, I would expect there to be evidence in your own life. So I am not opposed to using evidence in real time in the lives of people who were transformed by the gospel. But it wasn't my journey. Let me give you the last thing that was not the reason why I became a Christian, and that's this. I didn't become a Christian because I thought it would work for me. And I will tell you, this does concern me even today in a works-based theology that we see all the time. It's like a prosperity doctrine theology that says, hey, if you do this, God's going to bless you in this way, this way, this way, and this way. If that's really what we're in this for, because we think this system is going to bless us, or that we're looking for God's blessings, or that is not the story of Christianity. The Sermon on the Mount is very clear. He says, blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Not if they do that, when they do that. This is a system that if we embrace it, it's not going to work for you in the sense it's going to give you the happy, happy life. It's going to give you a true life. But a happy, happy life, only if you consider eternity. Remember, we're not finite creatures that just live to the grave. We live beyond the grave. So yes, in the long perspective, this is true, that that God is going to wipe every tear. I get that. But if we're only in it now, because we think it's a system that assures the blessing of God, you're in it for the wrong reason. And I often say this, I am not a Christian because it works for me. That's what I mean by that. I mean, I'm not a Christian because I think it's going to give me some benefit. Instead, it's going to do nothing but just as a matter of fact, I had an easier life before I became a Christian and if you ask Susie, she'll say the same thing. We were together 18 years before I became a Christian. We've been together 23 It's what, 23 cents? So on all those times, she'll say the first 18 were easier. Remember, it's always easy to throw the dart against the wall and just draw the bullseye around wherever the dart sticks. And I was doing that as a non-Christian. But then I realized there's a target there that I didn't draw, that's been sitting there all along, and I can't hit it at all. That's a harder life. And by the way, the moral teaching of Jesus is becoming very unpopular. So you're going to have a difficult life if you simply live the principles that Jesus taught. But there's a good reason to be a Christian, and it's the reason that I decided to be a Christian, and I hope it's the reason why you've decided to be a Christian. It's not because it works for you, or it will assure you heaven, or it'll assure you some benefit, or change your life, or because you want to know something you didn't know before. I'm a believer. I'm a Christian because it's true. Because it's true. Because it's true. That's enough for me. Even if it's not going to assure a happy life, even if nothing happens in my life that's transformed, it's true. If all I have is hardship from this point forward, it still would be true. And by the way, if you hold one of those other 6 views, I think these are good reasons to be Christian, but they're not sufficient reasons. I've known people who say they were transformed in other religious systems that are not true. That all the things we talked about, they've learned to know God in a false system. They think they know God. They will say that they were transformed by this false system. They will say they were raised in that false system, that their friends are in that false system. You could actually hold all the other views, all the other 6 things I just talked about, yet be a Mormon. I've known people who held one of those 6 views and are Mormon. You have to apply to it the test of truth, though. This might be why you're a Christian, because you were raised in the church, but have you tested to see if it's true? This might be why you're a Christian, because it changed your life. Have you tested to see if it's true? It might be that you are a Christian because your friends brought you into the group. Have you tested to see if it's true? In the end, is it true trumps every other reason to be a Christian. So still hold those other reasons, make them part of your personal testimony, but don't forget the is it true part. Can you make the case? Which is why we do this show, to give you the evidences so you can make the case and show that that transformation you experienced was under the true power of God, and you've tested it, you understand that that was God, not your imagination, and you can actually explain why. So I hope this show has helped you to see the difference in these explanations. And I'll see you right here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity Broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, and Alive.